Need for Speed Underground 2, often considered by many gamers to be easily the best game ever in the Need for Speed universe. But in saying that, there are other games that definitely capture the essence seen here and are equally on par, if not better, in many regards. But everybody's preferences will be different. What started with the original title in 2003 with the first Underground game, little did we realise the behemoth that the series would become from that point on. So when Underground 2 released in 2004, which would also see ports to the Game Boy Advance, Windows PC, Nintendo GameCube, Xbox, even the Sony PlayStation Portable or PSP, even as far as the Nintendo DS and mobile devices, make no mistake, this game got serious credit with regards to the majority of platforms that people could play games on at the time. But we really didn't realise how good this series was going to become, really, because this even inspired the PSP edition with Need for Speed Underground Rivals, which essentially would be the same type of game but a little bit more scaled down, but still a very good solid title all round. Even going back, I remember playing that from a mate in college at the time that I'd first got a PlayStation Portable, and one of the first games he got in it was Underground Rivals. And I remember playing it, we were sitting in the pub one day having a few pints, and he took it in with him, and myself and all the lads that I was in college with at the time, we were all playing a race each in it just to see what we thought, and it was very, very cool indeed. And that just would have come from all of the experiences that we would have had playing previous Need for Speed games. And even with Need for Speed Underground 2, it took everything from the original game and just expanding it onto an entirely different level. It would also be the first Need for Speed game to go through the open world, where you could literally drive anywhere you wanted within the city in which the game was situated in. That had even more modes, gameplay, aesthetics, features, more cars, an even greater and unique soundtrack, but adding in a whole host of additional features that was never seen in a video game before. Even with particular elements, we're seeing the game also being the first in the series to have a unique storyline tied to it as well, that presented itself in a comic book strip format, very similarly seen in other games from other genres. Even if you look at the likes of Max Payne that would have released in the early 2000s, for me that is one of the best story driven narrative based games I've ever played. But for me it was the comic book sections that really told the story, and it had that unique atmosphere tied to it. So you would start to see a lot of other games, even racing games, would try to take some of those elements and use them for their own, and did a really good job with it, and Need for Speed Underground 2 did do that. Now that would change with later sequels with Most Wanted, Carbon, where they would use more live action, like actors and sequences, using a variety of different filters for film and aesthetics and that would try to make it distinctive. But it did a good job in what it was trying to do. Even looking back, Underground 2 was also one of the first video games that I could play that you had the ability to even take photographs of your cars, almost like you could put them on the cover of a magazine, which it did allow you to do. There were certain elements in the game or certain objectives or challenges that would require you to take professional style photos, which would appear on the cover of magazines to show off your car and what it could do, which was very, very cool. So if you were in the early stages of trying to learn photography, this would have been a good avenue to take, as you could get a real feel for how things would be presented in a magazine format and even just on photo itself, which was very, very cool for its time. And that has since evolved with other games, like a lot of racing games. Even when you look at Gran Turismo 7 nowadays on the likes of the PS5, that has one of the most in-depth photo-based tools on any video game that's almost as good as using the camera, because the level of detail in that game is just absolutely crazy. But in a sense, Underground 2 did present very humble beginnings in that format, so yeah, for its time it was very, very cool indeed to have. But Underground 2, while it did have a story to it, it did follow a similar premise to the first game, where the game would allow you to play as a distinctive character within the game itself, as you rise to the top to become the best racer within the city. That would take you through many different plot events and challenges, racing against the top racers within the city, across many demanding challenges and events that would use elements from the first game, with likes of drift racing, drag racing, your typical circuit and sprint events, where you're racing from point A to point B in the fastest times possible, and you had to build up your reputation in order to gain the awareness of other known drivers to try and take over the territory. A very, very cool game. Very good, solid racer. It took everything literally from the first game and just expanded on it in ways that we never expected. I remember when this game was announced, myself and friends and brothers and everyone that was pretty much playing games at that time was so excited for the release of this game. I remember one of my local game stores, they were giving away free demos of the game in the shop, that if you bought something you would get access to a demo for free, which they were literally just handing out in the shop. Now it allowed you to play as a certain portion within the city limits itself, and you got to use the likes of the Mitsubishi Lancer and maybe one other car, and you had the option to do a few bits of in terms of tuning, and even get a fully tuned car to a degree, just so you can test it out and play in a couple of makeshift races and just modes. But it was very, very cool. I remember putting a lot of time into that demo, put hours into it, because it was a lot bigger than you would think, and especially for a demo at that time there was a lot of value in it, and considering you were getting it for free, that was just crazy. It was one of the best demos I think I've ever played. Even across the lifespan of the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2, I put a lot of time into that demo. It was very, very cool. So when the full game did release, yeah, make no mistake, there was a lot of hours put into this game. Like for me, I would go out on a limb to say this is one of the greatest racing games I have personally ever played. Now in saying that, when Most Wanted came out a year later, I was completely blown away by how much the game had evolved. Yes, it had moved away from the underground scene to a degree while it focused on more daytime racing, which to be fair tried to go for a different dynamic and had an even more intense story compared to Underground 2. While Most Wanted had a lot of characteristics for me personally that I really liked, and I would easily put down Most Wanted and Underground 2 as my personal favourite racing games in the series on the PlayStation 2, hands down. But there were elements that were different in each one that I liked them one more than the other. And while I absolutely love Most Wanted, and that for me that's one of the best racing games I've ever played, I still like the nighttime aesthetic in Underground 2 just a little bit more. I think for its time it was just because it was a reflection of that kind of period, because it was heavily inspired by the likes of the Fast and the Furious movies, which were a big deal during that period, and underground racing was essentially a theme. It was very popular, there was a massive culture around it, and the game just really suited that style, like even so much to a point that even back in the early 2000s, like people were even modding their cars, or like makeshift cars that they would have had from the games. People were doing that for real. The likes of the Max Power era, where people were modding their cars with consoles of the PlayStation 1 and PS2 more predominantly, so that they could play these games. And you can guarantee two of the games in question that would have been played the most was Underground 1 and Underground 2, as it just reflected that vibe and just that theme of around that generation. In all fairness, it's a very, very cool game. There's a lot to do, a lot to explore, there's so many modes available, and the fact is it got releases in so many different systems. It was just crazy to think. Now the rankings did mix and range differently depending on the platforms that they were on, but it's still highly regarded. While the evolution of the series with the likes of Most Wanted would be a better game in terms of its overall quality and just refinement, you cannot deny that Underground 2 is quite possibly one of the greatest racing games ever made. It really is. This was the game that realistically set the standard for everything that came after it. While Underground 1 got the ball rolling, but it would be the last game in the series to kind of move away from just limited race types where you just picked a car, jumped in and just raced in that particular event. In Underground 2 you had to drive to the events, explore the world, find secrets, complete different challenges and objectives, all while trying to involve yourself in an engaging story. It was one of the first racing games to really do that on a bigger scale, and it did a really good job, and honestly it did set the bar really high for everything else that was to come after it, even its own sequels, which in fairness Most Wanted definitely held its own in that regard. But even the other games in the series, while they're not as well thought of in many ways, like Carbon and even Pro Street, well, it moved away from all of that aesthetic totally, but then it kind of did try to go back to that with Undercover, which I think is a good solid game all around as well. But it did lose its mark with regards to that generation. I think that was the last kind of like hurrah. When you look at the likes of the way Need for Speed games were being developed back then, the three best titles essentially on the PS2, while the four best would have been the first one with Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2, although it was very different. Then you had Underground 2 and Most Wanted. They're the four best Need for Speed games in my opinion on the PlayStation. Now it's not to say that the others are bad, they are good solid games, but they are very different. But still, Underground 2 set the bar pretty much for everything that was to come after it, even with its future sequels, and then for a shed ton of other racing games that started to come out around that time as well. It set the bar really high for all developers to want to try and take a piece of that pie, if you will. Even so much today that when people look at the Need for Speed series, Underground 2 is highly regarded as quite simply being the best in the series, alongside Most Wanted, and quite rightly so. An iconic game, an iconic series all around, and it did set the bar very high. An excellent game, and just as much fun today as ever. Even going back to playing footage for this video, it's still so much fun. Yes, it's tricky, it's challenging at times, but it's still a very, very cool game. Can't deny it. But there are even more Need for Speed games that did release on the PlayStation that we do definitely need to look at, which we will do so in this next video. So it might be worth checking out.